The ground was dry and cold under the alien sky, dust carried in the wind, settling on every stone and broken wall of the labor camp. The place was not made for life, only for control. Chains clinked when the workers moved, their thin hands trembling as they tried to carry heavy loads. Among them was a girl, smaller than the rest, her skin pale with strange marks that showed her alien nature. Her eyes once carried pride, but now they were tired, empty, and afraid. She was not given a plate or a seat, only a handful of grain thrown into the dirt. The guards laughed, pointing, forcing her to bend low, to eat like an animal. Her face touched the ground as she picked each piece, while the crowd of slaves turned away, too broken to help. From a distance, a human man watched, his hands tight around the handle of his work tool. His name was Daniel, once a farmer on Earth, now a prisoner here like the rest. He had seen cruelty before, but something about this girl broke through the numbness in his heart. Her small frame shaking, her lips bleeding from the dust, her dignity crushed in the dirt. He turned his face, but the image burned inside his mind. Why should anyone be treated like this? Why should she be forced to crawl for scraps when she had the same right to stand tall? The overseer barked orders, his voice harsh and cruel. Work harder, faster, no rest for the weak. The guards obeyed, swinging whips at anyone who slowed. The sound cracked through the air, sharp like fire against skin. The girl flinched at every noise, too used to pain, too tired to resist. Daniel kept his head low, pretending to work, but his eyes always returned to her. He wanted to step forward, to push the guard away, to tell them she was not an animal. But humans here had little power, and even less safety. If he spoke now, he would be dragged, beaten, maybe even killed. And then who would help her? The day dragged on, the sun setting behind black towers of smoke. One by one, the workers collapsed into the dirt, too weak to move. The guards left, laughing as they closed the gates, leaving behind the silence of suffering. In the corner of the yard, the girl sat, hugging her knees, her face hidden. No one went near her, no one shared food or water. Fear ruled them all. But Daniel could not turn away, not this time. His heart thumped as he checked the shadows, waiting until the guards were far. Slowly, he moved to her side. She lifted her head, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark, strange and beautiful, but filled with sorrow. She did not speak, only stared at him as if expecting another cruel hand. Daniel knelt down and opened his pocket. Inside was a piece of bread, small and rough, saved from his own meal. He placed it on the ground between them, his voice soft. "Eat this, not from the dirt," he said, his tone carrying more command than request. The girl blinked, her thin fingers reaching slowly. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She held the bread, staring at it as though it was something sacred, something forbidden. Tears welled in her strange eyes, her throat tight with disbelief. For the first time in years, someone had given her food not with hate, but with care. Daniel stayed silent, watching her eat, his own hunger forgotten. Every bite she took was slow, as if she feared it would be snatched away. When she finished, she lowered her gaze, whispering a sound too soft for words. Daniel only nodded, rising to leave before the guards returned. But in his chest, something new stirred, something dangerous. He knew he had crossed a line, and once crossed, there was no going back. That night, as the camp sank into silence, Daniel lay awake on the cold ground. The stars above seemed far, unreachable. But his thoughts stayed with her, the girl forced to eat from the dirt, the girl who had looked at him with both fear and hope. He clenched his fists, breathing deep. This world wanted him to stay silent, to stay broken. But he knew the truth now. Silence was another form of cruelty. And tomorrow, he would no longer be silent. The next day began like every other, harsh horns waking the slaves before the sun. The air was bitter, filled with smoke from the factories, and the overseers shouted as if their voices owned the sky. Chains rattled as the crowd moved into the yard, and Daniel followed with heavy steps, his mind still restless from the night before. He could not forget the way the girl looked at him when he gave her bread, the way her eyes had held both fear and fragile hope. The guards barked orders, and the workers bent under their loads. Daniel forced his body to move, but his heart was not in the labor. He kept glancing toward the girl, who dragged stones with trembling arms. She stumbled often, yet every time she fell, A whip cracked near her head, forcing her back on her feet. Her lips were cut, her hands raw, and yet she said nothing, only kept moving. Daniel's chest burned with anger, but he hid it behind a blank face. By midday, the sun turned cruel, pressing down like fire. The workers were given nothing but scraps, tossed carelessly into the dirt. The girl knelt again, reaching with shaking fingers, and Daniel felt his teeth clench. The overseer laughed, pointing her out to the others, mocking her weakness. "See how low she is, she eats like a beast," he shouted, and the crowd looked away in silence, too broken to challenge him. Daniel's hand trembled on his shovel, his thoughts dark and dangerous. He wanted to strike the overseer, to silence his voice forever, but he knew that if he acted too soon, it would mean death, and not only for him. The girl would suffer worse. The guards would make her pay for his defiance. So he bit back his rage and lowered his gaze, even as every part of him screamed to act. That night, when the camp finally sank into uneasy silence, Daniel moved again. He carried a small flask of water and another hidden piece of bread. The girl sat alone, her body curled against the cold stone, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. When he approached, she flinched, but when she saw it was him, she stilled, watching with quiet suspicion. Daniel crouched and placed the bread in her hand. "Eat," he whispered, his voice steady but soft. She stared at him for a long moment before taking a slow bite, her thin shoulders shaking. He offered the water, and she drank as if tasting life itself, drops running down her chin. When she finished, she whispered, her voice weak but clear for the first time. "My name is Kira." The sound of her name struck Daniel deeply. Until now, she had been just the girl, faceless in the sea of suffering. But with her name spoken, she became real, human in her own way, someone worth protecting. He nodded. "Kira," he repeated, and she closed her eyes as though the word itself gave her strength. For days, this became their secret. Every night, Daniel saved food or water, giving it to Kira when the guards were gone. Every day, he watched her from a distance, his heart tightening at her pain. Slowly, Kira began to speak more, telling fragments of her past. Her people had been proud once, her family taken when the conquerors came. She had survived only by bending low, by obeying every order. But even in her broken voice, Daniel could hear the pride that still lived deep inside her. He taught her small things, how to chew slowly, how to lift her head when she ate. At first, she resisted, fearing punishment. But Daniel's steady presence gave her courage. Soon, she no longer ate directly from the dirt, but from his hand or from a small stone he placed between them. It was a simple act, but for Kira, it felt like freedom. Yet shadows grew. Other slaves began to notice, whispers spreading in the dark. "Why does that human help her?" some muttered. The guards noticed too, their eyes sharp, their suspicion rising. Daniel felt it every time a whip lingered near him, every time a guard's gaze stayed too long. They knew something was changing, and the overseers did not like change. One night, as Daniel passed Kira bread, a shadow moved nearby. A guard's boots scraped the ground, his voice sharp in the silence. "What are you doing here, human?" the guard demanded, stepping into view. Daniel's heart pounded, his body frozen. Kira hid the bread quickly, pressing it against her chest, her eyes wide with fear. Daniel forced himself to speak, his voice calm. "Nothing, just walking, couldn't sleep," he said. The guard narrowed his eyes, studying him for a long moment, before finally turning away, muttering. Daniel waited until the sound of boots faded before exhaling, his shirt damp with sweat. Kira looked at him, her face pale with terror. "You risk your life?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel met her gaze, his jaw set. "Some things are worth the risk," he answered. That night, Kira lay awake, holding the piece of bread close, her chest rising with quiet sobs. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her as more than a slave. She realized she was not invisible anymore, not lost. Someone had seen her. Someone had given her back a piece of her worth. But in the darkness of the camp, unseen eyes were watching. The rebellion in Daniel's heart had begun, and the overseers would not ignore it for long. Days turned into weeks, and Daniel's secret acts of kindness became the rhythm of his nights. Every evening, when the camp sank into uneasy silence, he found Kira in her corner, her thin body curled against the stone, waiting for him. He always brought something: bread, water, sometimes even a stolen fruit when he could hide it well enough. At first, she accepted with trembling hands, afraid of being caught, but slowly, she began to lift her head higher, her eyes no longer only filled with fear. Kira spoke more each night, her voice weak but steady. She told Daniel about her people, once proud builders and singers, now scattered and enslaved. Her father had been a leader, her mother a healer, both lost when the conquerors burned their village. Daniel listened in silence, his heart heavy, his fists tight at every word. He did not interrupt, he did not pity her, he only listened, and that alone gave Kira more strength than she had known in years. One evening, she whispered, "Why do you help me?" Daniel's eyes held hers, calm but fierce. "Because you deserve better," he said simply. The words struck her deeper than he knew. No one had ever spoken to her as if her worth was unquestionable, as if she was not broken, not less than human. Slowly, Kira began to change. When the guards threw food into the dirt, she no longer bent to the ground instantly. Instead, she waited until the guards passed, then cleaned the scraps on a stone before eating. It was a small rebellion, hidden, but to her it was powerful. Daniel noticed, pride flickering in his eyes though he dared not smile where others could see. At night, he taught her small habits, gestures of dignity. "Eat slowly, not like they expect," he said, handing her bread. "Look up when you talk, not down," he reminded. Kira tried, failing at times, but his patience never broke. Each step she took made her feel less like a slave, more like herself again. But change never stays hidden forever. Other slaves began to whisper more, some in awe, some in fear. "She stands taller now," they murmured. "The human gives her strength." The guards noticed too, their gazes sharper, their suspicion deepening. Daniel could feel it, the way a whip lingered near him longer than before, the way overseers studied Kira when she passed. Danger grew with every act of kindness, but neither of them stopped. One night, Kira brought him something instead. From her torn sleeve, she pulled a small, broken charm, an oval stone tied to a thin string. "This was my mother's," she said softly, pressing it into his palm. Daniel stared at it, shocked. "Why give this to me?" "Because," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "You remind me of her, you remind me of home." He closed his hand around the charm, his throat tight, knowing the weight of her trust. But trust came with risk. One evening, as Daniel slipped her food, a sound echoed behind them. A guard's shadow stretched long in the moonlight, boots heavy on the ground. "What do we have here?" the guard sneered, stepping closer, his eyes glinting with cruel delight. Kira froze, her body shaking. Daniel stood quickly, hiding the bread behind his leg. "Nothing," he said firmly, his voice low. "Just talking." The guard's gaze moved between them, suspicion darkening his face. "You think I'm blind? You think I don't see the way you protect her?" he hissed. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he forced his voice calm. "She is just another worker." The guard stepped closer, whip in hand. "Then you won't mind if I remind her of her place." Kira's eyes widened with terror, her body pressed back against the wall. Daniel's pulse thundered, his hand clenching around the small stone charm. For a moment, the world stood still. He wanted to strike, to tear the whip from the guard's hand. But if he did, the alarm would sound, the camp would flood with soldiers, and Kira would suffer more than either of them could survive. So Daniel lowered his gaze, forcing every muscle in his body to stay still. The guard smirked, sensing his restraint, and let the whip snap close to Kira's face, not striking but leaving a line of dust across her cheek. "Remember," the guard growled, "she is nothing." Then he turned and left, laughing into the night. Silence fell heavy. Kira sank to the ground, tears streaking her face, but Daniel crouched beside her, his voice steady. "You are not nothing," he said firmly, his hand brushing the dust from her cheek. She met his eyes, trembling, but in them she saw not just kindness, she saw fire. A fire that refused to let her believe the guard's words. From that night, Kira's bond with Daniel deepened. She trusted him with her silence, with her fears, with her small pieces of hope. And Daniel, though he never said it aloud, felt something stronger than duty grow within him. A quiet rebellion had begun in the shadows of the camp, a rebellion born not of weapons, but of dignity. But the overseers were watching, their patience thin, and soon, Daniel would have to decide. How far was he willing to go for her? Morning came with the same cruel horns, the same heavy boots of guards dragging slaves into the yard. But something in the air felt different, sharp like a blade waiting to fall. Daniel sensed it as soon as he stepped outside. The way the overseers whispered among themselves, the way the guards' eyes lingered too long. And when he looked at Kira, his chest tightened, for her steps were slower than usual, her hands shaking, and the whispers of suspicion had already reached her. The overseer shouted her name, his voice cutting across the yard. Kira froze, her body trembling, the bread Daniel had given her last night still hidden under her sleeve. "Come here." The overseer barked, his grin cruel, his eyes narrowing like a predator that had caught its prey. The crowd of slaves parted in silence, none daring to move, none daring to help. Daniel's hands clenched around his tool, his pulse thundering in his ears. Kira stepped forward, her head bowed low. The overseer snatched her arm, dragging her to the center of the yard. With a sharp gesture, he pulled the bread from her sleeve and held it high. "Food," he spat. "Where did she get this? Who gave it to her?" The guards laughed, some shaking their heads, and the slaves turned their faces away, fear choking them into silence. Daniel's heart dropped, his throat dry. The bread was his gift, his crime, his silent rebellion. Now it was exposed before everyone, and Kira stood at the center of it, her body shaking under the overseer's grip. She tried to speak, but the overseer struck her across the face before words could form. "You steal, you hide, you think you deserve better than the dirt," he sneered, throwing her to the ground. The guards circled, their whips ready, their laughter echoing. Kira pressed her hands against the dirt, her breath shallow, but her eyes searched for Daniel. For a single heartbeat, their gazes locked, and Daniel felt the weight of her trust press against his soul. He wanted to run forward, to tear the overseer apart, to shield her with his own body. But if he moved now, they would kill him, and she would suffer worse. The first lash struck, the sound sharp and cruel. Kira's body jerked, a cry escaping her lips. Another lash, and another, each one cutting deeper into her back, her skin tearing under the whip's bite. The slaves stood frozen, eyes lowered, for no one dared to speak, no one dared to break the rule of silence. Only Daniel stood rigid, his fists trembling, his jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "Let this be a lesson," the overseer shouted, raising his whip high. "No slave rises above their place." The guards roared their approval, the slaves bowed their heads lower. But Daniel could not lower his eyes, he could not pretend. Every strike against her was a strike against his own heart. Every laugh from the guards was fire in his veins. When at last the overseer dropped the whip, Kira lay motionless, her breath shallow, blood marking the dirt beneath her. The overseer tossed the piece of bread onto the ground beside her, sneering. "Eat now, like the animal you are." Laughter followed as the guards pulled back, leaving her broken body in the dirt. Daniel could not move, his body shaking with rage, his nails digging into his palms. His vision blurred, his mind screaming. He had stayed silent too long, and now the silence had cost Kira her blood, her pain, her dignity. Something inside him cracked, something that could never be mended. That night, when the camp was quiet and the guards drunk on their own cruelty, Daniel moved to her side. Kira lay curled, her body shaking with every breath, her back torn and raw. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he gave her water, as he tore cloth from his own shirt to clean her wounds. Her eyes opened weakly, meeting his with pain and something else, hope still, fragile but alive. "Why?" she whispered, her voice broken. "Why do you risk this?" Daniel pressed the cloth gently against her wounds, his voice low but burning with fire. "Because you are not what they say you are," he answered. "You are not an animal. You are not nothing." Kira's tears mixed with blood, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. But Daniel hushed her, his jaw hard, his resolve forming like iron. "This ends," he whispered. "I will not let them do this again." The stars above flickered faintly through the smoke, watching as Daniel's vow was sealed. The overseers thought they had broken her, but they had broken something else instead. They had broken Daniel's silence. And once broken, silence could never return. The camp never changed, its walls high and sharp, its gates locked with iron and fire. But inside, Daniel had changed. His silence was gone, his anger awake, his heart unshaken. Every time he saw Kira stumble under her wounds, every time he saw her forced to kneel, his vow burned hotter. He would not let her die here. He would not let her dignity be crushed again. At night, while the guards drank and the overseers slept, Daniel began to study the camp. He traced the patrol routes, counted the guards, memorized the sound of their boots against the stone. He watched the towers, the lights, the weak spots in the wall where rust ate through metal. The camp was a cage, but even cages had cracks, and Daniel's mind sharpened with every detail. Kira noticed his absence in the dark corners where they usually spoke. One night she asked, her voice still weak but steadier than before, "What are you doing, Daniel?" He looked at her, his eyes fierce but calm, finding a way out. She stared at him, disbelief heavy in her breath. Out? There is no out. No one escapes. Those who try vanish. Their screams echo until morning. Daniel shook his head, his voice firm. Then we will be the first, or we will die trying. But we will not live like this forever. Fear gripped her, but something else too. His certainty, his unshakable will. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine freedom, the taste of clean air, the feel of water not mixed with dirt. Her hands trembled, but her eyes lifted. If we try, we must try together, she whispered. Daniel nodded once, his jaw set like stone. The nights that followed were filled with quiet planning. Daniel showed her a map he scratched in the dirt, lines marking patrol routes, dots for towers, a thin path leading to an old drainage tunnel near the eastern wall. It's broken, he explained, covered with rust and weeds. No one guards it because they think no one is desperate enough to try. Kira looked at the map, her heart racing. Can we make it? Daniel's voice was low, certain. We have to. He trained her in small ways, teaching her how to move quietly, how to hide her breath in the shadows. He gave her strength with every lesson, even when her body ached and her wounds burned. You are stronger than you believe, he told her, and though she shook her head, she found herself trying harder each night. Piece by piece, her spirit returned, not whole, but alive. But danger was never far. The overseers noticed Daniel's sharp eyes, the way Kira no longer bowed as low. They whispered among themselves, suspicion thick like smoke. One evening, a guard muttered near Daniel, "We're watching you." Human, his grin cruel. Daniel said nothing, but inside, he knew time was running short. On the seventh night, Daniel crouched beside Kira, his voice low and steady. "Tomorrow," he said, "we move tomorrow night." Kira's breath caught, fear filling her chest, but she nodded slowly, her hands clenching. She had no strength left for hesitation, only for trust. The next day dragged like fire, every hour heavy with danger. Kira stumbled once, and a guard struck her, Daniel's rage nearly boiling over, but he held it back, knowing one wrong move could destroy everything. The sky bled red with sunset, and the camp sank into its drunken silence once more. Daniel and Kira met in the shadows, their eyes locked, their breaths quick. "This is the only chance," Daniel whispered. "Once we move, there is no turning back." Kira's voice shook but did not break. "Then let us move." They slipped through the yard like ghosts, each step heavy with risk. The night wind carried the stench of rust and smoke, but also the scent of freedom beyond the wall. Every shadow felt like a trap, every sound like a warning. Kira's heart pounded so loud she feared the guards could hear it, but Daniel's hand on her arm steadied her. At last, they reached the drainage tunnel, its grate half broken, rust dripping like tears. Daniel pried it open with silent strength, the metal groaning but not enough to alert the guards. "Go," he urged, and Kira crawled inside, her body scraping against the cold stone. Daniel followed, pulling the grate closed behind them, the darkness swallowing their shapes. Inside the tunnel, the air was thick and foul, but it was not a prison yard, it was not the overseer's whip. Kira's breath shook, but she crawled forward, her hands pushing against the slime and stone. Daniel behind her, whispering, "Keep moving. We're close. Keep moving." Every inch forward felt like miles, but then, at last, a thin line of moonlight broke through the end of the tunnel. Freedom lay just ahead. But behind them, far away yet closing fast, The sharp echo of boots began to rise. The overseers had noticed the hunters were coming. The tunnel walls pressed tight around them, dripping with foul water, the stench heavy. Kira's hands scraped against stone as she crawled forward, her body aching with every movement. Behind her, Daniel whispered encouragement, his voice steady even as the sound of boots grew louder in the distance. "Keep going, Kira, don't stop, freedom is close." The thin line of moonlight ahead widened, promising escape, but the noise behind them sharpened. Shouts echoed through the tunnel entrance, harsh voices barking orders. The overseers had discovered the broken grate. Kira's breath quickened, panic clawing at her chest, but Daniel's voice cut through the fear. "They won't catch us, not tonight," he said, his tone filled with steel. They reached the end of the tunnel, where a final grate blocked their way, rusted and weak. Daniel pressed his shoulder against it, pushing hard, his muscles straining. The metal groaned, sharp flakes cutting into his skin. "Move," he hissed, and with one last shove, the grate snapped free, falling into the dirt outside. Kira crawled out first, stumbling into the night air, her chest heaving as she inhaled freedom for the first time in years. Daniel followed quickly, pulling her to her feet. The wastelands stretched before them, dark and endless under the pale moon. Behind, the camp's walls loomed high, shadows of guards moving along the top, torches flickering. Alarms began to blare, harsh horns splitting the night. "They know," Kira whispered, terror filling her voice. "Run," Daniel ordered, gripping her hand, and together they sprinted into the darkness. The ground was rough, covered in broken stone and twisted metal, remnants of old wars. Kira stumbled often, her legs weak, but Daniel never let her fall, pulling her forward. Behind them, the shouts grew louder, the boots closing in. A sharp crack split the night. A gunshot. The overseers had opened fire. The ground near Kira's feet exploded, dirt spraying her legs. She gasped, her body freezing. But Daniel yanked her forward, his voice hard. "Don't stop. Keep moving." They reached the remains of a collapsed tower, its twisted beams forming a jagged shield. Daniel pulled her behind it, crouching low as bullets ripped through the air, sparks flying off the metal. Kira's chest heaved, her eyes wide with fear. "We can't outrun them," she whispered. Daniel shook his head, his eyes blazing. "We don't outrun, we fight smart." He scanned the wreckage, his hands finding a heavy steel rod. He gripped it tight, testing its weight, his jaw set. "When they come close, I'll hold them off. You keep moving east, toward the hills, don't look back." Kira grabbed his arm, her eyes fierce through the fear. "No, we stay together." Daniel stared at her, the bond between them stronger than the fear around them. Finally, he nodded. "Together then." The first guards appeared, shadows moving fast, their weapons flashing under the moon. Daniel rose from cover, swinging the steel rod with brutal force, striking one across the chest. The guard fell with a cry, his weapon clattering into the dirt. Kira snatched it, her hands trembling but her eyes steady. Another guard lunged at her, but she pulled the trigger, the shot echoing across the wasteland, the figure collapsing. Her body shook with shock, but Daniel's hand steadied her. "You're stronger than you know," he said quickly. More guards poured out of the tunnel, shouting, firing. Daniel and Kira fought their way through the wreckage, moving like shadows, striking fast, then vanishing into the dark. Every step toward the hills was a battle, every breath stolen under fire. But with each moment, Kira's fear turned to fire, her courage rising beside Daniel's unshakable will. At last, they broke free of the wreckage, the hills rising before them, jagged shapes against the moon. The guards' shouts faded slightly behind, though bullets still cut the air. Daniel pulled Kira into a narrow ravine, the stone walls hiding them from sight. They collapsed against the rocks, chests heaving, bodies shaking, but alive. For the first time since the escape began, silence surrounded them, broken only by their ragged breaths. Kira looked at Daniel, her voice trembling but strong. "We are free, at least for now." Daniel nodded, his hand tightening on the charm she had given him. "No, not just free," he said, his voice low, his eyes blazing. "We have a chance to live, a chance to fight back." Kira closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. But this time, they were not only from pain. For the first time in years, she felt not like a slave, but like a person again. And she knew it was because of him, the human who refused to stay silent, the human who gave her back her will to stand. But far behind them, horns still blared, and the overseers were not finished. The hunt had only just begun. The hills rose like broken teeth under the pale moon, sharp ridges hiding shadows deep inside. Daniel guided Kira into a narrow cave, its walls damp and cold, but safer than the open ground. They collapsed against the stone, their bodies trembling from the escape, their breaths ragged. For a long moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of wind outside filled the silence, carrying distant horns from the camp. Kira leaned back, her face pale, her wounds aching, but her eyes alive. She turned to Daniel, whispering, "We are free. Daniel, I never thought I would breathe air outside those walls again." Daniel studied her, the marks of the whip still raw on her back, the dirt clinging to her hands. "You are not just free," he said firmly. "You are alive, you are worthy, and you are more than what they tried to make you." From his small pack, he pulled what little he had carried, bread, a flask of water, and a folded piece of cloth he had saved. He spread the cloth on the stone floor, placing the bread upon it, not in the dirt, not thrown, but set with care. "Eat," he said gently. "But this time, eat as you should, not as they forced you." Kira stared at the bread, her eyes glistening with tears. Slowly, she reached out, her hands trembling, and lifted the food to her lips. For the first time in years, she ate without shame, without fear, without bending to the dirt. Tears rolled down her cheeks, falling onto the cloth, her voice breaking. "They tried to take everything, even my name, even the way I eat, but you gave it back to me. You gave me back myself." Daniel's chest tightened, but his voice remained steady. "No one can take your worth, Kira, not as long as you remember it. They only made you forget, and I was only here to remind you." Kira reached into the torn fabric of her clothes and pulled out the charm he had once held. The small stone tied to its string glowed faintly under the moonlight. She pressed it into his hand again, her voice shaking. "This belongs to you now, because you carried me when I had nothing left, because you made me believe I was more than dust." Daniel closed his hand around it, feeling the weight of her trust, his jaw tightening with resolve. The night deepened, and outside, the horns of the overseers faded into silence. The hunt would not stop forever, but for now, the hills shielded them. Daniel looked at the sky, stars burning above the smoke, distant and bright. "We are not safe yet," he said, "but we are alive, and tomorrow we move farther. There are places they cannot reach, places where your people might still live, where humans still resist." Kira lifted her head, her eyes filled not only with fear now, but with hope. Hope that tasted strange, sharp, and beautiful. In the cave, Daniel set up a small fire from dry sticks, its glow warm against the stone. He placed the bread beside Kira on the cloth, not like a prisoner, but like a friend. She sat straight, no longer curled into the dirt, her back still scarred, but her spirit rising. As she ate, she lifted her head high, not lowering her gaze, not hiding. Daniel watched, and in that moment, he knew the overseers had already lost something they could never reclaim. They had tried to break her, but instead, they had awakened her. Kira spoke softly, almost to herself. "I am not an animal. I am Kira." The words echoed in the cave, simple and powerful. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice quiet. "Yes, you are Kira, and no one will ever make you forget it again." The fire flickered, casting their shadows long against the stone. Two figures side by side, scarred but unbroken, hunted but free. For Kira, the chains had been more than iron. They had been humiliation, silence, and the dirt forced upon her. But now, with a human's defiance, with his kindness, those chains had shattered. And as the night stretched on, Daniel knew this was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger, a fight not only for survival, but for dignity. For Kira, for himself, and for all who still bent under the whip. Tomorrow would bring danger, but tonight, she sat tall, her dignity restored.